in a second. The Visiting Artist Program, funded by PAFA's graduate program, brings an outstanding roster of local, national, and international artists to PAFA each semester for lectures, critiques, and workshops. The program exposes students and the public to a range of artistic approaches and fosters discussion about contemporary art and ideas. This afternoon, we are pleased to have Kylie Lockwood joining us. Kylie Lockwood, originally from Detroit, Michigan, is an interdisciplinary artist whose work reconciles the experience of living in a female body with the Western history of sculpture. Lockwood received her BFA from the College for Creative Studies in Detroit and her MFA from Hunter College in New York. She has been an artist in residence at the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture, Hambidge Center for Arts and Sciences, Offshore Residency, Caldera, and Contemporary Artist Center. Lockwood also completed a permanent public sculpture in collaboration with the Department of Cognitive Neuroscience at the University of Oregon-Lewis Integrative Science Building. Her work has been exhibited at Simone DeSousa Gallery in Detroit, Michigan, PS1 MOMA in Long Island City, New York, Cranbrook Art Museum in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan, Cleopatra's at Brooklyn, New York, Lord Ludd in Philadelphia, Synchrotron Radiation Center in Stoughton, Wisconsin, and Coop Gallery in Nashville, Tennessee, as well as Interstate Projects, Brooklyn, New York. Lockwood currently lives and works in Hamtramck, Michigan. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Kylie Lockwood, and you may now begin sharing your screen.
Okay, great. All right. Okay, so first off, I just want to say thank you to everyone at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Art for having me as a visiting artist. Okay, so I'm going to begin my talk here. And this, I'm going to set up some elements that permeate the rest of the work that I'm going to show you. And this piece for me was a real beginning. And so I want to talk through this work as I lead up to the next two bodies. So this piece is entitled Porcelain Legs in the Posture of David. It was made in 2016. The materials are porcelain, unfired clay, nail polish, plastic bag. So this is actually from my show at Cleopatra's. Cleopatra's was an amazing gallery that was open for 10 years, run by Erin Somerville, Bridget Finn, Bridget Donahue, and Colleen Grennan. And it was a two-person show entitled Statue Maker that I did with the artist Rebecca Gilbert. And so making this work is a convergence of multiple concerns that span my practice. And when I made this work, I had opened up, I'd given myself permission to open up some borders that I had unintentionally placed in my practice. And so this was, for me, a work that was a huge realization where I let multiple things that I'd been keeping separate collide. And so this is some of the writing that I produced while I made this. I have mimicked David's posture. I stood with my body in the position of his stance. I occupied the space of David, but I have also knocked the sculpture down. Only a portion of the legs remain, a fragment of a former monument. Through the process of directly pulling plaster molds off the surface of my legs, I am making a fossil. The molds capture the performance of that moment, that stance, the plaster attempting to render stillness from my animate surface. The molds are filled with porcelain and emptied. The porcelain shrinks when fired. It becomes a concentrated, vitreous version of my flesh. The legs stand on a pedestal of clay. Each toenail is painted with nail polish. The base is soft. The material is in flux. It cracks and shows stress as it slowly dries. The base is uncertain. It's compromised. So digging through, so this is the first time that, so thinking about all those things that I've allowed to collide. And those things include personal history, art history, interrogation of my subjectivity, interrogation of my body, copy, reproduction, empathy, sculpture, performance, the mark of time. So, and I've already talked to some of those things in what I've said before, but some more background knowledge. So pulling from my personal history. So my maternal grandmother was a porcelain doll maker. She taught me how to cast porcelain at a young age. And so porcelain for me is not just a material, it's part of my lineage. It's part of who I am. And so that's a huge part of what I'm bringing to this, this work in terms of personal subject matter. This was also the first time that I let art history into my practice in a real overt way. And I was struggling with some things, and I realized for me to communicate what I wanted to communicate, to talk about fragility, to talk about empathy, to talk about something subtle, to talk about something that had a huge amount of weight, I needed to graft that experience onto something else that it could be read through. And so this is where I began to reconcile my experiences through the weight and the baggage of art history. And so in 2016, another thing happened, and I'm just going to briefly touch on this here because this is actually a whole other lecture. So in 2016, I just finished this big collaboration with Darren R. Blank Goldhammer at the Department of Cognitive Neuroscience at the University of Oregon. So that's what you're seeing here. It was a percent for the Arts Commission. So it was a publicly funded artwork that is in the Lewis Integrative Science Building. And this project, I learned so much from this project. And this project was amazing on so many levels. I'm not going to be able to outline all of that here. But it's important to know that this project was a space that that I engaged in some really deep research. It was a multi-year project. I was stepping into things, and I was really expanding my practice and allowing myself to do some things that I hadn't done before. And also I was stepping into another discipline. I was stepping into another institution. I was an artist coming to a scientist. We were collaborating. Although I have a huge interest in science, my background is in art. I don't have a background in science. So it was such an amazing opportunity to step into this other institution, to step into this other discipline and be able to work within it and talk through it. And so this has really affected and influenced my work moving forward. So I just want to like pull that up to the surface too. So working on these really like long form projects is really where my practice now resides. Okay, but back to this work. So, so this work is not only an engagement of art historical concerns, it's an engagement in iconoclasm. So I am not only embodying a sculpture, I'm knocking it down. But it's also important that, for me, that it's not this complete rejection. There's this, it's not a complete iconoclasm. Because it's not, you know, I'm embodying this sculpture, I'm standing in the position of this sculpture, but I also am putting my body in place of the sculpture. So I'm knocking down the sculpture, I'm not also knocking down myself. So there's an implication there that is really important and core, and something that you're gonna see moving forward. And so there's also this collision of inheritance that I wanted to talk about. So the collision of my personal matrilineage, my inheritance from my grandmother, both in terms of the material discipline I'm working with, but also genetic inheritance. I am, in a sense, a copy of my maternal grandmother. And I wanted to put that and have that rub up against my inheritance and my art historical patrilineage. I wanted to put my grandmother up against Michelangelo and the weight of Western art history. I wanted to put porcelain in the place of marble. I also wanted to turn porcelain into marble. You can't see in this image, but in documentation of this work, so the leg that goes up to the knee, I modeled broken marble on the top of that knee. So that porcelain leg references that break in the marble. And then the foot is left completely open. The foot is left with the mark of slip cast, the mark of the porcelain slip. So the next thing that happened in 2016 is I experienced a break. And I experienced, my own physical break, and I experienced an existential shift. In 2016, I became pregnant, and the next year I gave birth to my first child. And so this is a page from my notebook. I can see on the opposite side notes from a presentation I was working on with Darren, the cognitive neuroscientist. We were talking about the terms in our disciplines that were problematic, the terms proof and beauty. So I'm going over the things that I'm working on. I'm beginning to pick my practice back up. I'm beginning to work on new work. And I wrote, I need a new word for my body. So I needed new words. I needed to find language. I was in a space where I had this void that I didn't have language for in my experience. And this is the work that I made, attempting to find language for that void. So this is an install image for my exhibition, Becoming a Sculpture, at Simone DeSousa Gallery, which opened at the end of 2019. But rewinding back to making this work. So stepping into this new subjectivity, I picked up my research. I dug through, I'd done a whole, in preparing for the work that I thought I was making, I was digging into, the Renaissance's inheritance and readdressing of Greek and Roman sculpture. And so I had all of this research, all of these folders of things that I was looking through. And so I just began going back through, and I looked at things really differently. And I saw my research in a way that I didn't see it before. And I found myself empathizing with sculptures that I'd completely glossed over before. And I realized, and then so this specific sculpture was one that kind of stopped me in my tracks. And I was like, I saw it completely differently. And I didn't have the language to describe that. And I knew that I needed to confront this next, and that this was the sculpture that I would talk through. So this specific sculpture is the Crouching Venus of Vienne. It's from the 1st or 2nd century CE, and it's in the permanent collection at the Louvre. And so this is some writing I did about the history of this sculpture. This sculpture is a copy. It is a Roman marble copy of a Hellenistic original that predates it by approximately 500 years. No remains of that supposed original form have been identified. It has undergone a complete deterioration. And this marble copy has been in the process of wearing away for the last 1800 years. Knocked down in the ancient city of Vienne, this marble Venus found its crouching body in a new orientation as it settled on the bottom of a river. An ideal representation of a female bather is submerged in water. The gravity it once defied, grinding it into the bank of the Rhine. The movement of the river and its sediment slowly wear away the paint that adorned the sculpture's surface. Over 1,000 years, this sculpture exists unseen as a stone at the bottom of a river. And so this is these are a couple other views of this sculpture as it's exhibited. So here you can see, this is the trope of Aphrodite at her bath, Aphrodite à couper, the crouching Venus. And with Venus comes Eros. And so you can see here, here and over here, a fragment of Eros's hand, Eros being personified as a cherub or child. And so you have this absurd remnant of this former relationship on, this sculpture doesn't even have hands, but it has the remnant of this cherub's hand, Eros's hand on its back. And there was so much that I connected to. And I knew that I wanted to explore attempting to find language to describe my experience and how I was seeing it through this sculpture by attempting to become this sculpture. So I set about my studio to attempt to become this specific sculpture. And very quickly I met obstacles. And the obstacles, there were many. And I realized there were physical obstacles with my body. There were technical obstacles in trying to create that sculpture. And I realized that I wasn't going to be able to get it in this first attempt, that becoming that sculpture was too much. I didn't have the time. I was not at a place where I could do it yet. So I realized if I can't become this sculpture, I will hold this pose. This sculpture is a motif. It's one of many. And so, so I began doing some deep research on the crouching Venus and digging up as many examples of it as I could find. And then I read about it, I got books on it, and I dug through, I studied the things that were consistent, the things that changed, the things that were always the same. And then I began attempting to reperform this pose, attempting to cast my body, attempting to reperform this sculpture. So, and I want to talk about these sculptures a little bit more. These sculptures are problematic. The history of how they're talked about is problematic. They've been whitewashed. In their original state, they were adorned with paint. These sculptures are idealized. They're idealized in so many ways. And even in reading about that, knowing about that, and digging into that, I'm attempting to make my body occupy this ideal position. And I knew that there was going to be, I knew that that was important, and that was that the failure in doing that was really crucial for this work. The impossibility of doing that was really crucial. But still, there were things that I got caught up in trying to reperform this pose, trying to get my rib cage to shift and my hips to be in the same position, the same level of compression and openness, my foot to have the same angles. And so for me, this was a really potent space to situate this work, and a really potent space for me to talk through. I wanted to make this work, I wanted to talk both about empathizing, having empathy for this form, having sympathy for it, feeling a relational experience with a sculpture, seeing something that was 1,800 years old and feeling like 1,800 years, that's nothing. That's not a lot of time. But then also in the same moment, hating the sculpture, hating so much about it. And so that was really crucial. I realized I needed that confliction. And that confliction was where I wanted to, that confliction was crucial, and that confliction was where I wanted to situate the work. So I was also reading Bruno Latour's book on iconoclash, and there were some things that he talked about in that book that were also really, really influential to how I was thinking about this. So in his introduction, he states, "When one does not know, one hesitates and is troubled by an action for which there is no way to know without further inquiry whether it is constructive or destructive." So suspending the urge to destroy, looking at something one loved to hate, but with a renewed sympathy, a craving for a carefully crafted meditation, and asking, what does one want to protect and what does one want to destroy? And so for me, this was a really important outline for what I was doing in this work. And so what you're seeing here on the screen are the photographs that accompany, or 3 of the photographs that accompany the sculptures in this exhibition. And so also talking about this stage of my work, talking about letting things collide, talking about opening up barriers, giving yourself permission. This was a place in my work where I allowed myself to think of my entire practice as performance. And so the documentation of making, there's so much in the act of making, in producing these molds, that is about performing, about attempting, about becoming. And that's not just something that's embedded in, or it's consequential to the end and the reception of the work. So I needed to not leave that hidden in the history of making these sculptures or the history of underneath. I mean, it's in the marks of the sculptures themselves, but I needed to bring that to the forefront and have it be overt. And so here you're seeing the photographs that I made in my studio as I'm making the molds to produce these sculptures. And so I'm pulling the plaster directly off my skin. And, you know, I'm both holding the pose to, you know, long enough to cast, to pull a mold, to get a pull of one side of a mold. And then I'm having to get back into that mold. You know, I'm having to cast the other side. And in some cases, there were 4 parts to these sculptures. And so I was having to get back in a 4th time and hold that pose a 4th time in that one mold, trying to get that to align. Alignment became an ideal, became a very obvious and oppressive ideal that I was butting up against and trying to work against. So the other thing you're seeing here, and I want to make a note of, and that something's really important about practice, and then also an extreme note of gratitude. So the image that's on the far right, you're seeing, you know, I've got my cell phone out. So some of these are taken with my cell phone. Some of these are taken with my DSLR. And but here, you know, I'm photographing into a mirror. I had mirrors. I have mirrors set up on the studio for me to see myself hold that pose. You can see there's copies of the sculptures behind me. I'm looking at it. I'm trying to get, you know, I'm attempting to occupy this ideal space. I'm attempting to align. And the other thing that I'm doing here is I'm both subject and author in this. I'm both inside and outside myself, which is another impossibility. I can't do that. I can't both be inside the molds and make them. Or I had butt up against in the work before this. I did do that for a long time, but I reached real barriers of what was possible. And so I knew I needed another set of hands. And so in this image, in this photograph on the right side, you see the hand of my studio assistant, Lisa Tolstika, who I have immense gratitude, and I feel extremely fortunate that I was able to hire her to help me produce this work. I feel extremely fortunate to be able to hire her to help me produce this work in terms of her skill. She herself is an artist. And also, I'm putting myself in an extremely vulnerable position. I needed someone to help me make this work that I could trust. And Lisa has been that person as I've been making this work. And sometimes I would bring in a third person, but for the most part, I'm making this work pretty simply, as you can see, in my studio with the help of just usually one other person. And so that's both, so that's both part of my process, but then also in terms of acknowledgement, something that I want to make sure is talked about here. So these are some other photographs of from that series. And in attempting to occupy an ideal space, I am doing that with less than ideal means. You know, we were inventing rigs for me to hold these sculpture or hold these molds, get back into the molds. But in many cases, you know, in some cases, I'm holding it onto my skin. You know, you can see it here in these images. Okay. And then here's an install shot of the work. Okay. How does one describe feeling empathy for a sculpture? In what manner could you explain identifying with an ancient form and having epiphanies about the concept of time? This encounter is a crack, a fissure that disrupts basic comprehension. How do you describe the experience of an existential shift? This work is predicated on a specific experience, yet explaining it is fraught with many snares. The moments the word, my experience of becoming a mother, leave my mouth, the field is flooded with unconscious idealizations, heedless summarizations, and false understandings. I am frustrated with this, yet I do not have the language to explain it. Still, I now see the snare and the insidious nature of its hold. This work is in many ways a resistance to the desensitization of that self-awareness, an attempt to further activate and keep in play my sensitivity to the existential shift I experienced from stepping into a new subjectivity. And I am seeking to interrupt that image and interrogate it from the inside. So also thinking about time, thinking about performance. So there's the performance of making the work. There's the performance of having these, you know, there's performance of re-performing the pose. And then once the sculptures are made, I am mounting these sculptures on blocks of wet clay. These are solid blocks of clay. And so then at the beginning of this exhibition is the last layer of this sculpture's performance. And this sculpture is a different time. It's a glacial time. These sculptures move, they shift, they perform. They are put under an additional layer of stress as their bases shrink. The ground they're standing on shrinks underneath them. And so this sculpture, although it's not perceivable to the eye when you're looking at it, over weeks, the sculpture moves. The gaps between its joints expand. Its foot mars the surface of the clay as the clay moves underneath it. The other foot shifts from a stable balance to being tipping on the interior edge of its foot. The planes of porcelain that make the back go from touching, and then they expand and they open. And so that's also in having each step of this work being performance and performing, and also having these bodies, these sculptures, be in a position where they are undergoing, there's compression, there's physics, there's stress, they're enduring something. That was really important for this work. Okay, let me check time. Okay, good. So this is another angle of this sculpture. And then I want to read some writing that I did after this body of work, in thinking about what I wanted to take on, both in the next body of work that I'm going to show you, and then work that I haven't made yet that I'm gearing up to make. My work is a confrontation of a real, aging, fallible body attempting to interrogate a foundational aspect of Western art history. This critical investigation focuses on themes of personal history, loss, embodiment, and expanding the sculptural vocabulary of the canon from a feminist and performative lens. I am also engaging an art historical tradition, that of looking back at the works of antiquity, re-examining the past to contextualize one's contemporary concerns. Empathizing with a sculpture that was knocked down during the collapse of a society seems of great consequence to the present moment. It has never been clearer that sculptures which represent people are of great consequence to the people who see them. Challenging canons, interrogating histories that preference singular narratives, matter to everyone they touch. Monuments and statues matter. Seeing oneself represented in a monument and statue matters. Conversely, seeing those other than oneself represented in monuments and statues matter. How one breaks a statue matters. How and why one restores a statue matters. And then I'm going to show you this next body of work. So this is a show that I just finished. So I've exhibited this work, but it's not on my website. It's really only pretty much been shown physically. So this is the video that was produced to advertise the show.
In my work, I re-explore art historical poses through the use of my body as sculpture. For Envision, I'm specifically looking at the pose and the sculpture of Michelangelo's Pieta. I'm currently pregnant, and so I'm both delving into that personal subject matter, art historical subject matter, for multiple reasons. For this sculpture, because this sculpture is so much more of an iconic sculpture, I was actually able to buy postcards and ephemera from this sculpture. One of the things that I'm doing is working with this ephemera and beginning to develop a relationship and explore some of the content and questions that I'm examining myself through these objects. So that's where the work begins. Then there's a lot of planning to figure out how I want to go about readdressing these poses. And then much of that work is I'm pulling casts directly from my body. Then there's a whole stage of mold making. And then through that mold making, I'm then casting sculptures. For me, I mean, one of the best things about being a viewer of art is getting to witness an artist's delving into questions. For me, there's multiple questions that I'm beginning to ask and experiences that I'm exploring through this work. So much of it is delving into unknowns. And so I think that that discovery is both as an artist, but then also as a viewer is one of the best things to get to witness when you look at work.
So in 2020, I was invited to take part of the inaugural exhibition Envision at Stamps Gallery at the University of Michigan. And shortly after receiving this invitation, I became pregnant for the second time. And one of the amazing things about this specific opportunity was that I was invited in 2020, but the show wouldn't be happening until later in 2021. So I had this opportunity, both it happened at the right point for me in terms of timing, and then also I had the time to make this body of work. And I knew that I wanted to take on the subject of motherhood. I wanted to take on that content directly, because although it's very much an aspect of the last body of work, it's not overtly apparent, and I wanted to deal with it overtly. So in doing the research, I looked at a bunch of sculptures and I was sifting through, okay, what pose, what sculpture do I take on? I even thought about just taking on the genre of the Pieta. I researched a ton of different Pietas. And in the end, I was like, no, it needs to be Michelangelo's Pieta. It needs to be this sculpture that has so much weight, so much baggage that comes with it. And I needed the problems of this sculpture to butt up against. So in this work, I began thinking, how do I reperform the Pieta? So as I said, as I said in that video, I began doing research and I began buying postcards, and I was actually looking at some estate sales, and I came across this at a church that was liquidating. And I remember seeing it in context with other objects, and unfortunately I didn't grab that image. I wish I had. But I looked on this table of a bunch of objects and I saw an excellent reproduction of Michelangelo's Pieta that felt like it was the right scale to not be a reproduction, but to be a cast. And so unfortunately, I couldn't get to that. You could only go and purchase things in person. I couldn't get to that. But I couldn't get there. But I ended up looking on eBay and searching for this and then finding one and buying it. And when it arrived in my studio, I turned it over and saw the back for the first time and realized, and so on the back is a label. This was produced by the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And it is itself, this is a facsimile copy authorized by the Vatican Museums. And it's produced by the Department of Scientific Research, the Vatican Museums, and it is pulled from direct impression molds of the original sculpture. So then I got really excited about this. And then the second thing was the date inscription on the back. And so this was made in 1982. And so there's a couple of things that got me really excited about 1982. One is 1982 was the year I was conceived. So this sculpture, this specific head I was holding was as materially had been in its configuration as long as I'd been in my configuration. And the other thing I knew based on my research is 1982 is 10 years after the Pieta was attacked. So in 1972, Laszlo Toth, a Hungarian-born Australian geologist, attacked Michelangelo's Pieta. He got up with a rock hammer. He went at the sculpture, taking off Mary's hand, knocking into the head. You can see here there's like this attempt of like this, like almost knocking off the head. He wasn't successful at doing that, but he was successful in knocking off part of the nose, the eyelid, and other parts of the head before he was apprehended. So here you can also see his apprehension in getting pulled down. And so I began digging into press photos and buying the press photos I could find on eBay. And this is one of the press photos that I purchased. And here you see them assessing the damage. You know, here we have a close-up, that we're holding a close-up print. We're looking at the damage of the sculpture. And then I came across this group of images, which is from the molds that they made after the sculpture had gone through trauma, to attempt in their labs to figure out how to repair, how to take this trauma and that this sculpture had gone through and how to enable its recovery. And there was the point where I knew it was like, ooh, I am not just going to be in dialogue with the sculpture. I'm going to be in dialogue for this show with this head, because this is something I overtly connect to, which is this is mold making, not just to make a copy, not to just make a multiplication. This is mold making as an act of recovery. This is making a mold to augment trauma. And this is what I wanted to be in dialogue with. So I began making molds in my studio. That's the reason I wanted to show you that video. You can see in that video setups of what I was doing. And so, like I said, I'm gearing up towards bodies of work that I am going to be making. And I'm eventually going to be creating a full sculpture that is readdressing the full Pieta. But with the timing that I had, I couldn't do that for this show. For this show, I knew that I wanted to relate to this head, and I wanted to build the base of the Pieta. I wouldn't get to the figures yet, but I'd build the base. So I pulled the title of this show from the label. The title of this show is called Facsimile, and this is the introduction that I wrote for it. What is the affect of a reproduction? What are the emotions, forces, sensations that exist between the form of one copy and another? In this exhibition, I convene with a museum replica of the head of Michelangelo's Pieta. I use my pregnant body to blur the boundaries between myself and a sculpture, interior, exterior, subject and object, the torso of one mother with the head of another. So while I'm producing a whole series of molds, which the photographs and a lot of which is coming in future bodies of work, I began relating to this head and attempting to join this head with my torso. And I also wanted to make some work that would occupy a larger field of emotions in the show, and occupy a field of tonality in the exhibition. So I titled these very pragmatically. This photograph is Pregnant Torso with Head of the Pieta against Mirror and Sky, and it's just purely that, me laying on a mirror, with the head, placing the head. So they're very simply made. But I wanted to talk about this disorientation. I wanted to talk about the spectacular. I wanted to talk about the spectacle. I wanted to talk about observation. I wanted to talk about objectification, alienation. This is mold of pregnant torso with detail image of the Pieta. I wanted to talk about the dark. I wanted to talk about the suspense, holding one's breath. I wanted to talk about the light. I wanted to talk about waiting. I wanted to talk about the absurd. I wanted to talk about humor. I wanted to talk about the rupture, sharp, break. I wanted to talk about the trauma. And while I was making this photograph, I had my own rupture and I gave birth, and I kept making these photographs and I kept pairing the head with my torso, attempting to merge the two. So here, this is postpartum torso with the head of the Pieta. I wanted to talk about after, recovery, repair. I wanted to talk about horizontality. I wanted to talk about lamentation, foreshortening, extreme horizontality. And I wanted to talk about the repetition, repeating oneself. And I wanted to talk about a new disorientation. So, and this is the sculpture that accompanied the photographs. This is abbreviated Pieta. It consists of 1,300 pounds of unfired clay, resin, epoxy, Carrara marble, and a facsimile copy of the head of Michelangelo's Pieta. And then I also included an additional head on the back wall, which you're seeing. So there's actually 2 of the museum replicas in this show, which you see the 2 on the last image that I showed you here. And so here they are in the show. And this is some documentation of me making the work. So I made this sculpture. So what this is, you know, in doing my research, I pulled as many different images of the Pieta as I could. And this is the first attempt at the Pieta, and here I'm making the base. You know, the 2 figures are up, or the 2 figures that, there are 2 figures in this sculpture, but the 2 figures you would expect to be there are absent. And so this is modeled off of the bench and the stone plinth that the Pieta occupies. And so I made it on hand over 3 days. And I embedded in this sculpture 2 other sculptures, and you see them here. So one is that museum replica there. And then the other is a negative cast of my pregnant stomach that I produced in the exact same composite of materials, this like resin epoxy with, I went and got Carrara marble and ground it and put it inside. So it had the same materiality as the head. And then I put it inside the sculpture. I wanted both sculptures inside and to penetrate this base. I wanted to put that head down. I wanted to put it inside. I also wanted to, you know, there's ways that I'm tender to the head in the photographs, and I wanted to face plant this head in the sculpture, and I wanted to put it down, and I very carefully made it blend with and modeled it with the surface of that stone where the feet of Mary would reside. And I also wanted to prioritize the label. I wanted you to pay attention to the back. And I wanted that to be the part that really you encountered when you walked up to this sculpture. And then after the show was open, I unwrapped the sculpture and let it dry. And I anticipated, or I could anticipate what might happen. I thought the sculpture might crack the cast of my stomach. But what actually happened over the weeks after the show was open is that the cast of my stomach and the head acted as a wedge and split the 1,300 pounds of clay completely in half. There's a crack, and you can see it here at the bottom, and it runs all the way to the back of the clay. And so that clay is completely divided in half. And so again, there's this additional layer of performance. There's this additional layer of contraction, compression, and then rupture and break that's happening here in this sculpture. And here you can see it a little closer. The clay also tends to like try to expel and push the head back out. And then the last thing I'm going to show you is something that is a realization that is also like a leftover that I'm still chewing on. And this is something that I didn't say in earlier work, but each time these sculptures are installed, I am reinstalling them on a fresh block of clay. The clay that the sculptures reperforms. And then when the show is taken down, I break the clay apart. And that it's completely taken apart. And so that performance, there's also a performance on the end of it. And at the end of this, in taking this show apart, I got to unearth this head from its base. And when I pulled it out, I got to see it. I hadn't seen it for weeks. And this head, its time in that wet surface of clay, it molded. And it had this experience and time when it was inside the sculpture that was revealed to me when I unearthed it at the end and I took this apart. And so this is another place where like this is the end of this sculpture, but it's also the beginnings of some things that are coming forward. And that's where I'm going to stop my talk.
Wow, that was so fantastic. Thank you so much. Everyone, you can start putting your questions in the chat and I will relay them to Kylie. I spoke with you a little bit earlier about talking about the way you were able to find residencies and spaces to have these beautiful, gigantic ideas and the mental space to process them and the workspace to accomplish them. And while folks are coming up with their own questions, if you could speak just a little on that.
Yeah, so Christy and I were talking when we met earlier today, preparing for this talk. I was talking about residencies, and yeah, that was residency. So I think I did like 5 residencies within the span of like 3 to 4 years after grad school. And I learned so much during those. And that was in addition to grad school being an amazing experience of growth and expansion, going to residencies was a really incredible learning experience. And depending on how the residency was set up, I got access or it served a different function. Like Skowhegan was an amazing learning experience. And you're there with over 60 other artists and you get to see your practice in a space of 60 other artists practice. And I learned so much by doing that, by seeing what I was allowing myself to do and what I wasn't allowing myself to do. And that was a huge growth stage for me. The other thing that I want to that Christy, you and I didn't talk about that I want to note about Skowhegan that was amazing was it's a 9-week program, and you're there for a significant amount of time that you get to really explore something, but also you have the time to help other people. I helped other peers with their projects. They helped me with mine. And that was incredibly valuable because I learned things, I got access to things, and I experienced things that I would, in normal life, you just wouldn't have the time, or you wouldn't be in the same place. So you wouldn't have, and so that was such a potent experience. And then and that was actually the residency where I applied for the project that I wrote my proposal for the project with the cognitive neuroscientists during that residency. And so that's the other thing that I want to say about residencies and applications and applying to things in terms of learning and expanding one's practice and growing is that because to go to residencies, to get grants, to get opportunities, you have to put together applications. And there's a couple years right after grad school where I was applying to as much as I could, and I was getting pretty much all rejections. But I was working on and envisioning my work in these other scenarios. I was envisioning projects that my work hadn't, that places I hadn't been with my work, projects that I hadn't done. I mean, that project that I did with a cognitive neuroscientist began as, ooh, what would it be like to collaborate with a cognitive neuroscientist? And I wrote that proposal. This is what I would like to do. And so that was really like an amazing learning experience. And I got better at it by doing it. And there was a ton of really bad applications, and still like applying for things, writing, submitting, having to even putting together this lecture, right? Having to recontextualize and take all the disparate spray of what you're doing and send it through a channel is every time you do that, you learn a lot.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That was going to be my next question, was how did that project with the neuroscience get started? I love that you had a curiosity and you just followed it.
That's
all it is. Yeah.
I had no context. That was an opportunity that popped up on the College Art Association's opportunity page. And I remember when I applied for it, because it was one of those things where I was like, oh, I'm never going to get this. And I just like shot it off and was like, oh, good. I mean, that was a good experience writing and thinking about what I might do in that experience. And then I got it. I was accepted, and that was an incredible experience. So yeah, I mean, that was, pay attention to opportunities and just keep applying. Yeah.
Thank you. How much does the location where you make the work influence? Like, does that have an influence, or, and when you're making work in these areas that are away from home, or when you're making work at home? And I loved the pictures with the plastic bag. I've been there. That just cracked me up when you're just like in these goofy positions to make this thing that no one ever gets to see, all the silliness involved. And that was fun. Thank you. But yeah, it's like the area, the place that you're making this in, does it come into the work?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're seeing, there in the photographs, you see the mirrors. In that case, so referencing specifically my studio, the mirrors that I'm using to see myself as I'm, I put mirrors on all sides of my studio and stacked them so I could see myself as I'm holding this pose. And then the mirrors became a place where I was shooting into the mirrors and using the mirrors. And so I'm pointing that out because that was also a realization in that work where I knew I was documenting the work as I was making it. But it was also, that show,
It's like the circumstances. I mean, that's sort of what you've been saying, how like the performance of making the piece, the circumstances that it's created in become a necessary component.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I don't know, like, if we have questions coming in, you guys can ask away. Anyone? I'm so excited. I see a lot of the students that are here, I know, are gonna enjoy their critique time with you. I can't wait to hear the hear the after effects, because it's very, we come to PAFA as and then it's like a straight crash course in reckoning with the art history. And so I really appreciate you taking us on your like mental exploration journey with that. I mean, because it is a thing that you keep pushing up against, and then having to kind of claw your way out. And what do we want to keep and what do we want to preserve? And those are just some very key things to my experience through this, that I'm sure just with our affiliation to the historic institution that we're part of is definitely, like, I'm not the only one. So
yeah, totally.
Yeah, but you see those sculptures and it just brings a tear to your eye, and there's so much humanity, and then there's all this like culture that gets like put into the atmosphere around it, and it's like, well, but I still need that moment, that tender moment when the first greeting before all the stories, there's something there too. That hand on the back, oh my gosh, sorry.
Oh no, that's
okay. Wait, we have questions now.
No, I mean, that's
like, it's so neat because you're like, is she being pushed in, or is this a tender? Is it a tender touch, or is she being like pushed into the river? And either way, that's where she ended up.
Yeah.
All right. So someone asked about transportation. Like, is it a hassle to transport such large work?
Oh yeah.
That's in pieces.
Yeah. Yes. It's a hassle. You have to invent. I mean, not only have to invent. I mean, also there's a whole other. Like, I could also talk about, and that sculpture, that original sculpture that I was attempting to become, was a sculpture that needed a support system. It had no feet, its feet weren't there, its arms weren't there. And so I'm attempting to create something. In order for me to occupy that pose, I had to create this support system, and then to reperform and to move these sculptures. There's all of this. So like even I was sitting on a block, and so I'm inventing things in the studio, make things that are makeshift. And things, I put a block of clay, and I sat on a block of clay because it was a really like soft but like strong supportive thing to sit on. And then that block of clay became the block that went in the sculpture. And so the sculpture sits on that block of clay. And there's the same groove. And but in inventing, is it a hassle to transport your work? Yeah, you have to, and then all these support systems to get the work there. And then there's all of these things to get it to, there's all of these, I'm creating all of these armatures that are underneath the the sculptures, that hold the sculptures in space, and then allowing for it to be fixed, but then not too fixed. So that way the sculptures move and the sculptures shift. So there's also a balance with that.
Have you ever had anything get sort of destroyed in transport, or I mean,
yes, I've had something, learning how to, especially and then you have to learn how to, then you have to learn how to pack. How do you mail things in exhibitions that you can't, then there's a learning on like, how do you augment, how do you pack all of this work so that way it can arrive and then get assembled on hand. It's a very, there's precarity throughout each step.
It's the leap of faith. So we have a question from Kelly Lawler. Were you making your own molds in the earlier work?
Yeah, absolutely. I've been making molds the entire time. So mold making, and that was also a really key thing with this body of work. And I have some other writing that I talk about this specifically, where the mold is not this like secondary or like subsidiary of the work. The mold and the indexes of the mold show up in the work itself. So it's really important that, I'm not ideally, I do this with my pregnant stomach because I had to, because I couldn't use plaster in the same way safely. And so that body of work, which I didn't show you photos of making, but you can see parts of it in that video. That's coming in like either the next show or the show after the next show. But it's really important that I'm in attempting to and butting up against this ideal, you have this like physical mark of all of this misalignment. So one, you have so it's important that not only I'm making the mold, but that I'm making the mold and it's like you see the pressure of the mold into my skin. When I get back in, you see the misalignment or the way the flesh moves and the gap, the thing that cracked. The mold that was the hardest to achieve was the chest. It took us so many times trying to get this chest mold to work. And I broke the back portion of it so many times. And one of the things that's embedded in that chest mold is we'd created all of these substrates and supports for my body, but while I was making that chest, I thought about the weight of my body. I thought of my legs. I kept tried to get my feet in a comfortable position. And while we were casting that front of the chest mold, I completely forgot about the weight of my head. And so, you forget about it, but then when you're in this position and you're holding, then all of a sudden the weight of your head pulls back because I was in the position for, a good 45 minutes to an hour. And so as we're making the mold, I'm pulling myself and breaking the mold as my body's breaking it, it's cracking. And then we're, I was like, just put more on. And so we're, and then that shows up in the end, those cracks, which on first glance, maybe look, they're akin to the broken sculpture. They're akin to those fragments. There's portions in that neck that feel like the broken stone, but they're evidence of my body and that plaster coming into having a collision with each other and putting stress on each other. And that stress shows up in those cracks and those breaks and that fragment. And so, so it's not only important that I'm making my own molds. Mold making and the mold is a huge, central tenet in my work. It's a huge, it's not just secondary. It's a primary aspect.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well,
Thank you.
we do have a few comments that people are excited for their crits later, and Sherry and Zofia and Kelly have mentioned. Also, Sun Yun Kang appreciated the powerful concept in your works, and thank you for sharing. And that kind of brings me to the conclusion of our time. I'd like to thank you so much, Kylie, for your amazing presentation. And once again, I'd like to thank everyone for attending this week's Spring 2022 penultimate Visiting Artist Program lecture with Kylie Lockwood. We hope you enjoyed it and look forward to seeing you next week on April 13th for our final Spring 2022 Visiting Artist with Sun Young King, who is here in the audience today. So I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of the day and that we see you next week. And I appreciate you all. And
Thank you. Thank you
finish the
everyone for
recording now.
coming. And thank you for this opportunity.